Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 13. This week's guest is photographer Carolina Montejo. So, I met Carolina at the Medium Festival of Photography last year. We were both getting our portfolios reviewed, and we were standing outside the review room, waiting to go in, and we got to chatting, and, you know, as often happens at these events, we showed each other our work. And I was impressed because here was a body of work that felt very new. Her work visually is engaging a lot with the nature of digital imaging. And while that's a subject I've seen a few times before, this work felt like it was working with that idea in a more mature, developed way. Plus, on top of that, a big part of her current project is a science fictional story that goes along with the images. And, you know, since writing and photography are the two forms that I work with, I'm always really interested to see what other people are doing to marry text and visuals together. Now, this main series that we talked about for the episode today, it's called Era, Fragments of an Evolving Landscape, and I put a link in the show notes for that. The version of it that I saw, which you'll hear us talk about it, actually, and how things have moved on even from what I saw a few months ago. Anyway, the version I saw was basically a short story imagining an intelligent machine in the distant future, long after humanity is gone. And this machine is imagining and dreaming and recreating images from these references that it has from its past. And then the photographs you see, the photographs that are in the project, they're highly pixelated and often distorted into circles or otherwise manipulated. These represent the images that the machine has created. Anyway, I do recommend checking out Carolina's website where you can see the images. Before we get started now, a couple of notes about the episode. First, there's a little break about 20 minutes in where our conversation got interrupted by an Amber Alert blaring out of our cell phones, so I had to cut around that a bit. Second, due to an audio issue when I was recording, there's no second segment, as there would usually be. What I'll say, though, is that the topic Carolina chose was artificial intelligence and spirituality. And we had a pretty good chat about that, and it got pretty heavy into sort of the philosophy of intelligence. And I'm very sorry you won't be able to hear that. But if you want a little taste of it, there was an article that she referenced at the beginning of our conversation, which was sort of what motivated her to pick the topic. And it's from a site called eon.co, and the title is Omens. I put a link in the show notes for that. And basically it's an interview with a man named Nick Bostrom from Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute. And it's all about artificial intelligence and existential risk, which is to say, this is a guy whose job it is to consider the future, consider what kinds of technologies might pose a threat to the existence of the human species. It's sort of a dark topic. The article is a little unsettling, but if you're interested, a lot of what we had talked about, Carolina and I, is it's informed by that article. Anyway, here we go with my conversation with Carolina Montejo. So we met in October at the Medium Festival of Photography.
Yes.
And you were holding your book. We were about ready to go into the portfolio reviews. And we just got to chatting. You showed me your book. And I remember thinking that there was a lot of stuff about your work that I found pretty exciting. That one, like it's your visual style, the technique that you use is very experimental, and that is not a thing that I feel like I see a lot of. Mm-hmm. On top of that, the book that you were showing me was something that was, heavily incorporating text as well as images. And that's something that is, for me, as someone who's trying to be both a writer and a photographer, that's something that I find really interesting. So So I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about with your work is that when I go back, I went and, after we met, I went and looked up your website and researched your work a little bit. And that there's this really clear progression as you go from the older work to the newer work, that it seems like you've always had an interest in a certain amount of abstraction and experimentalism with your work, but that as you progress, the work becomes more, obviously more, you're playing with the digitalness of it more. And I guess the thing that I was first wondering was, like, how did that interest in playing with the medium that way, how did that get started?
You mean with the digital?
Yeah.
Well, like you said, it's and yes, you can see that progression in the images, but I think that progression is it's not just the experimenting with the image itself. For me, it's been more of just experimenting, because, for instance, now I'm more into installations. So, that beginning has now taken me to a whole other place that is, it's not just the post-photographic visual aspect of it as the digital image, but it's also creating sculptures, collecting or objects that already exist, in terms of like ready-madeness, and combining them with images that I produce and text. So for me, it's just, I guess that experimenting is more with mediums. Now the digital part, I think came because I just have always liked machines, and the history of photography itself is always about the machine, about this new machine that appears. Because with other arts like drawing or painting, it's always up to just the person. Obviously there has to be talent and concept and discipline and all these things, and of course the paintings and the colors and that kind of thing, the more object related things. But there's never like another eye. And with photography, this new eye is given to you by a machine, So this kind of, I don't know if it's because I'm a millennial. It could be. There's obviously some generational component to it, I think. But we're just... machines have always been part of kind of the development of the generation. And so I've always found it interesting. And not just the machine itself, but the machine within a context. So for me, contemporariness has always been an important part of all this quest. I mean, I don't know if it's a cliche, but as an artist, I do want to talk about my time. Without disregarding other times, because I love history, and my projects show this kind of desire I have to bring together things of the past with things that are very, very contemporary and even go into the future. Yeah. So it's the machine, but it's also the machine now. The machine, what it means right now. And the machine is digital. I did start taking analog. I did use the analog camera first and everything. It was a beautiful experience, but somehow the computer, the digital, the fact that there's a reinterpretation of the information there was just always so interesting to me, visually and conceptually. So I just started to let that take over until it became more and more digital each time. I guess because I was just more and more interested in trying to find how that language could really translate into my own world and my own ideas.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like, particularly the work that you were showing at Medium this past year, the era of Fragments of an Evolving Landscape, is that the right title?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
That
work, it's interesting hearing you talk about it, your work in terms of commenting on the contemporary moment, because that work, particularly with the text involved, seems in some way to be, I mean, the most obvious reading of it is to think about it in terms of the future rather than the now. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense, but yes and no. The thing is, maybe because I'm just like so into that, I read a lot about that kind of stuff, you know, and it's really not that much about the future. That's all happening right now. You know, there are so many companies that are pushing forward artificial intelligence. You know, space travel is like, you know, booming right now.
There's that SpaceX thing that just happened.
There's just so much stuff related to space and related to like high tech and to artificial intelligence, and so for me, the question is like, yes, it's about the future, but it's not about, oh, what will be of the future. It's about what are we doing now that will have an impact in the future, or what is being researched now that we will see as something more real in the future. But the future is already being built right now, you know, like the present and the future, it's just not that cut out. Neither is the past. It's just like something that is kind of expanding. And so I guess it is futuristic in terms of, if you want to put a name to it, it's futuristic because it definitely, I mean, the story is like supposed to happen like in the way, way, way future when we don't even know if the planet exists, or maybe it's the present and the machine is just like stuck in some kind of time vortex or whatever. We don't know, but it is, I guess it is futuristic.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's obviously like the literal reading of the text, and then the images with the text are, you know, of a far future machine thinking about the past. But obviously, you know, the most literal reading isn't always where the meaning and the theme is delivered. But I do think that's an interesting, like, your work is so directly commenting on the medium itself and how the information, the visual information, is encoded, and how we receive that, how we decode that information, in a way that you know, more straight photography isn't really, doesn't seem to be concerned with in the same way. And it's one of the things that I find, like, what I find exciting about, you know, different work is when I see people where there's an analytical component to it, you know, where there is, like the two of us, we both sat in and saw Drew Nikanovich's lecture, and where he was, you know, talking about virtual spaces and that kind of thing. And I think, you know, as I was thinking about it, like that, I thought that would have been one that was as interesting to you as it was to me. But the pushback that he got from a lot of the audience members during the Q&A was interesting, because there was a certain way that his analysis and his willingness to reject certain assumptions before making the analysis seemed kind of threatening to some of the people. And I kind of wonder if that's something that you have gotten as well, because your work is pushing on certain conceptions about what photography is, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, I think I have. I mean, right now I'm reading this really amazing book that someone suggested, this anonymous person who gave me a review, and it's called The Reconfigured Eye. Mm-hmm. I have it right here, and it's just such an interesting book, and it's by William Mitchell, and it's an amazing book, really, and it's 20 years old, you know, but it's still very, very current, maybe because when it came out, people just weren't ready for it,
right.
You know, but it talks about that problem with the digital image, or the image that isn't what people relate directly to the original referent, you know? So if you see this bed, then you see a picture of a bed, then it's a direct translation of the reference that you have.
Right.
And so the work that I do doesn't do that, and work like other artists are doing that, that also experiment with that kind of image, that kind of photographic image. I think it challenges people because they have to process it more, you know, and the rejection can come from many different angles. It can come from, I'm too lazy because everything comes to me through the media already processed. It could be something generational, because photography isn't supposed to be that way, because, you know, you can be very classic about it, or you can be very contemporary about it, but yes, there can be a rejection from different places. But it's because of that processing that has to be done. And I do feel like there's been some difficulty with people and my images, because it presents them with some fears, because also, you know, technology is kind of like either feared or worshipped in a way, you know? And the pixel is something that really bothers people, and it's something that I use a lot. And it really, really bothers people.
Yeah, particularly when I find with photographers, that is something that really seems to bother them. And I think this thing you're saying about technology being feared, it's interesting because I think with your work, especially when you add in the context of having this sort of science fictional story that goes along with it, that is one that is really commenting on things like the nature of consciousness and that kind of thing. I think a lot of people find sort of scary just by itself. But then sort of looking at your images more just as images, and particularly as photographic images, that, I mean, there have been people actually, I mean, for several decades now, who have been interested in exploring what's unique about digital imaging. There's a guy from, I don't know when he started, if this series of his was like in the 80s, where his name is Todd Walker, who did some really pioneering work in engaging with digital imaging as its own thing. And I'm pretty sure that his work got a lot of pushback as well, because he was started as a more like traditional darkroom photographer. I feel like there's this sort of, I've said this to other people on the show before, that there's this sort of inherent conservatism about photography and photographers, where people really want it to be a particular thing. And when you start messing with that thing, whether it's through, making photographs that aren't really lens-based or that aren't really referential, or whether it's work like yours where it's very obviously technologically mediated. I mean, all photography is technologically mediated, but yours is like is putting that on the surface, right? Like it's really like you're telling people that it is. And it seems like photographers in particular find that kind of experimentation, often find it very threatening.
They do. They find it threatening, and I think that with my work, it goes beyond that, because some work I'm also just using photography as something that exists and not necessarily that I take. Now, I use a lot of my own images because I do go out with my camera, and I particularly love taking pictures of landscapes. And I've included landscape and portraiture in my work since the beginning. But right now, I'm also just taking photos that already exist and working with those photos. So photography just goes beyond, because yes, it's photography, but it's also just web content. You know, it's a photo that another person took, but it's still photography, and it's mixed with a photo that I took. And then I'm also using Google Earth, which is a camera, you know, but you can't see it. There's no lens anywhere. You have a screen, and you decide where to stand, and you decide, you know, in a very virtual way, you make decisions based on space and I guess some light conditions, and then you take it. So that complicates things a lot more. So it was about how these images.
Completely
it was like, yeah, Amber Alert. How the classic.
That's right. So you were saying, yeah, living, respecting and valuing the classic, but living in the present.
But trying to create your own, you know, and using the tools. I mean, hey, a hammer is great invention, you know, like, you know, that's classic, you know, and we still use it. But does that mean that we cannot use like a power tool?
Sure.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that I have to walk around with like hammers and like old, like medieval, like tools in my shed. They're great. And sometimes I use them because, you know, they work for certain things. But sometimes I use what, you know, has been created now. And for me, I really have a deep appreciation for photography's history. I know it. I've read about it. I even taught history of photography as one of the very important classes that I taught when I was a teacher in Colombia. And because for me, it was really important that students knew about it, you know. Because you really do have to know about it and appreciate it for what it is. And I love straight photography and analog photography, but it's just not my thing.
Right.
That's just not who I am.
Right.
As an individual. I sometimes I mix it with what I do, but it just doesn't tell the stories that I want to tell. So, and another thing that I wanted to talk about was another book that I have here. I have a whole bunch of books, but this is also a book that I think was very important, and it's Permutations on the Picturesque by John Fall.
Okay.
And this series has been really, really important because he starts using these very traditional landscapes, and then there's a slight pixelation. You know, you barely see it. But he starts a conversation, and this was...
that photo you were just showing me said 95, 97 on it?
Yes, this is 97, which is kind of the same time that this book, The Reconfigured Eye, came out. I mean, it was the early 90s when all these, like, things were happening with digital photography, and he was pretty traditional. He also did kind of a more, like, installation kind of based work with very traditional. So he mixed things, and I think that he's an interesting artist because he knew how to be true to what he wanted to say. And so I think that it challenges people because they just expect that only what they think has to be the way that it is,
right.
you know, and they're not open to, you know, this is great, but there's other stuff. And
right.
it's the same when you show a painter, even a very like now painter that isn't like painting, you know, landscapes or you know, something very traditional and classic, and you show them one of my works, there's always like this face, you know, there's a face, there's like and I don't know about it because they think it's easy to make, because it's too like it's just too different, and it's not, they can't relate to it in a classical sense. The referent again. The referent is difficult to find, and it needs a lot of processing, and it needs a lot of information.
Right. It's interesting because, you know, I my experience has been oftentimes that painters, you know, people talk about how the advent of photography and photography being able to make such technically perfect representations really is what freed up painting to become more expressive and more abstract. So like my experience with painters has usually been that experimental photography is something they tend to be more open to that kind of thing than like traditional straight photographers are. But then you're saying like that's not necessarily the case.
Not necessarily, but because, you know, there are all different kinds of opinions
That's
from
true.
different kinds of painters, and, you know, sometimes you'll run into someone who's more conservative, someone who's more willing to go more into the world that you're trying to create or whatever.
Yeah. One of the things that I have always thought was nice about painting as opposed to photography, at least in how it's understood, and in some ways how it's practiced, is that painting doesn't seem to be beholden to the same ideals of like classically beautiful things that painting has allowed people to find beautiful expressions in ways that are not like they're not the normal easily understood like figurative beauty, you know, like a beautiful classic portrait or a beautiful classic landscape. Like we can all appreciate like a Caspar David Friedrich landscape, but we can also recognize that like somebody like Rauschenberg or Pollock, you know, those two things are not similar in how they look visually, but we can still, we've become conditioned to understand that this other kind of beauty exists. And I feel like that's something that painting has taught us and has come to in a way that photography hasn't quite. Like there are people who are working in different aesthetics these days, but it isn't as well understood and accepted by the artistic community at large. Like your work is not, by and large, the kind of easy to understand classic beauty, but they're beautiful nonetheless. You know, like there is a beauty to the way that, like, I mean, this picture that I'm looking at it right now, it's on your wall. That picture is gorgeous, right? I really like looking at it, and looking at it like aesthetically, it has, like, I can appreciate that on a purely aesthetic level. But it's different from how I would appreciate like an Ansel Adams picture, you know. But I don't know, like photographers and even just the general art viewing public, they seem to be more willing to accept a broader expression of beauty in other media than photography. Do you find that?
Yes. Again, it depends, because maybe younger generations are more willing.
Maybe.
I mean, I remember when I had these pieces on view at the San Diego Art Institute, and there was this really, really young guy, and I started talking to him, and then, my work is here, and he's like, which one? And so we went, I took him over to, and he was like, oh my God, I love this. And I had never received enthusiasm like that from people that are of other generations, you know. This was like a 18-year-old, and was really into that kind of beauty and image construction that I wasn't getting from people that are 60. You know, they were more puzzled by it. Not that they didn't think it was good or beautiful or ugly or whatever, but it was definitely a little bit more difficult for them to access that realm of beauty or that aesthetic composition. Or I think that's just because painting has had a longer history.
Yeah, that seems to be the common thing that I hear from people.
Yes, because, everything needs to mature. It's very important to go through all the stages. Actually, my machine that I'm writing about, that is the backdrop to this series that we've been talking about, matures during its existence. And maturing is not overrated. It really does have to happen. And when things mature, other things that before weren't appreciated start being appreciated, and your view changes. And so I think that that's part of it. I mean, I'm sure there are other components, but I think that we're getting to a point where we're starting to push that limit. And that photography is coming to another point where other things are appreciated. Just like I mentioned with people that are maybe younger, they're starting to see images in a whole different way. But for me, it goes beyond just the image.
Right.
It's about, particularly in my world, in my work, it's about a world. It's about a whole experience I create, or I want to create, and that's why all that experimentation with image has eventually led me to connect with other things that I'm interested in, which are literature, sculpture, findings, and creating an experience where all these things kind of come together and portray a different art piece, an art piece that integrates more senses, and not just visual senses. Yeah, and
that's one of the things that I really find, exciting about your work and about other people who are willing to sort of mix different media. When you say mixed media, you usually think of like an installation kind of thing, but like finding people, like the difference between photography or any visual art and literature, and finding ways to put those together in ways where they complement each other and the whole is more than just either piece put together. It's very challenging. It's one of the challenges that I've certainly faced with my work, where I also will try to incorporate text and images, and I find the really big challenge is finding ways where the text doesn't just become captions and the images don't just become illustrations, but that each one is doing its own thing that contributes to the whole.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult. But you're, not least of which because both parts have to be good in themselves.
Yes. Yeah, that's the most difficult, right?
Yeah. But you're, So I remember, I think this is in your statement even, and definitely we've spoken about it before, that one of the early inspirations for the literary part of your project was Jorge Luis Borges, right?
Yes.
And that's an interesting, how'd that come about?
Well, particularly the Borges thing, I'll come back to that, but I did want to mention first that, yes, when you take on something like that is this multidisciplinary, which seems to be the way that art is going a lot these days too, you know, it's a huge challenge as an artist. It just means that you're really committing to a project, like you're ready to commit to marry this project, you know, because you really have to dedicate a lot of time, and if you're obsessive, like I personally am,
I think most artists are to one degree or another.
Right? Yeah. And a perfectionist, and if you're you know, you have to be a little mad in certain ways. It's very difficult because, like you said, you don't just want one thing to like be on the side of the other and look pretty. Like for me, like writing the story is a whole nother like artistic component that I really want to excel in, and also the image, and you know, then installing it in a space just becomes a whole nother thing, a sculptural piece, an experiential piece, you know, and so it just takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and for me, it's like I've always wanted to incorporate the text into the photography, into the image, but it never felt right.
Yeah.
It just you know, it felt, I just could never manage to do it. Only in Technical Recreation, which was the series that came right before this one, did I start doing it, because I started thinking of things more in the film way, and like movies, which you know I love, and which are a huge inspiration also for the way that I see and build stories. And so I started using them as captions, like for movies. You know, like if you were to take a screenshot of a certain point of a movie, and you would see this, like, you know, caption, because I watch a lot of subtitled movies. So that kind of subtitle, and because I'm also a translator, it just, you know, it's the way it works for me. And that's the only first time that it began to feel like, okay, this feels like a place where they can definitely both, the text and the image, be really, and not just seem like, oh, it's trying too hard, you know? And then with this one, it just all developed very, I don't know, it's just one of those like mysterious things. I had made the decision of starting to write a story alongside the body of images that I was working on, and not that I read a lot of Borges, you know. It's not like, oh yes, in all my readings of Borges I found this story. That's not true. I actually always considered myself more of like, I was into Cortázar a lot more than I was Borges, because just much more surrealist, which is something that I have also been very influenced by, and Dadaism. And but the Borges thing happened because my husband, he knew that I was writing this story. He knew that I was building this new world, this fiction, and coincidentally, he was, I don't know, this story appeared as part of his program. He's getting his master's, and someone like mentioned this story, and so he started reading it, and it's part of the Garden of Forking Paths, of that series of stories.
Yeah, and the one particularly that you mentioned was the Tlon, Ukbar, and Orbis Tertius.
Yes.
Yeah.
That. So he was so excited. You know, we get really excited about each other's projects, and he was like, "Oh my God, this story is like, you have to read it. It's like." Not saying that it was about the same things that Borges was writing, but he was like, it's, you know, it's just about what you want to talk about. It's about these worlds, these parallel worlds, and it's about fiction. And so I was like, what? And, you know, he just showed me one of the paragraphs, and it was kind of like a collective madness kind of eureka moment. And so I read it, and I was very inspired. And that happens to me a lot. Like, I'll be working on something, and then when I've already started working on it, something else will show up, and it's interesting because it's like finding a friend. You know, it's not like I'm looking for inspiration and then I go and find something and do what that thing is doing, but it's like I'm already on that path, and then something shows up, and I'm like, wow, you know, and I feel like someone understands where I'm going. And I don't know if it's like too like pretentious to say that Borges understands me, because, you know, he's such an iconic, like, erudite, intellectual, and like genius of literature. But I felt like we were on the same page, Borges and I.
Yeah.
And then I felt the same way recently with this Italian artist who wrote this thing called the Codex Serafinus. Anyway, I'll have to get back on that name. But so this book has transitioned again, and you still don't know about this because these changes have happened in the past like 4 days. Oh. But it's still a book, there's still a story, but now it's kind of like an encyclopedia.
Oh.
And I'm committing to doing 3 volumes of it. So it's
You're really not kidding about marrying the project.
Yeah. I'll have other little projects on sides that won't be that one. But I am very committed to create an encyclopedia written by this character that I've created, which is Kali, which is the artificial intelligence satellite that drives the whole storyline. And so I had decided, you know, I'd been working on the new organization, the new layout of the book, and I had been stuck really for a long time, and it just didn't seem right. You know, I just really try to be true to, and if it just doesn't feel good, I really know that I'm not being a perfectionist. I'm just not there yet.
Yeah.
And then I was like, you know what? I went to this show the other day downtown San Diego, and I don't remember the artist's name, but it was such an amazing installation, and it inspired me because it reminded me of being in school. And so being in school brought me back to the book itself, you know, because I think about the book as different things. What is a book? And so it brought me back to textbooks and to like film projections where, you know, the teacher would sit there like showing you projections in history class or whatever, and you would see, you know, you would be told a story about history and these images would go with it. And I was like, okay, my book needs to be a kind of design, not that it is a textbook, but it needs to have more that personality of an educational tool. And so I started rediagramming, and then one day I was looking for a name for my translations company, like totally not related, and I came upon Codex, and I was like, that's a great name for a translations company, you know? I like love Codex. It's so like a manuscript, like something like old school, like legit. And then, you know, Google sends like all this information, which is what's great about, you know, now. You get all this information. You put one thing and all this information comes to you. And that's a huge inspiration for me too. And so it said Codex Serafinilus or something like that. I was like, what's that? And so this artist from the 1970s created this fictional codex, very surrealist encyclopedia with a language that he invented, and with pictures that he drew. And it wasn't about any subject in particular. It was just like a surrealist fictional book. And on the bottom of the page, it said, other references were that story by Borges.
Yeah, you can definitely see the reference
So I was
there.
like, oh my God, this is like, you know, I get excited and crazy about these coincidences, these signs, and so I was like, wow, I can't believe that this is all like, now I have this friend in the 70s, you know, and Borges, and it was really interesting, and so that was just inspirational, because I looked at this codex that he made, and not that I'm trying to make something like that is the same, but I'm not inventing a language. I'm just using code, computer code, as a language. But not just computer code. I'm turning that computer code into images, into pixels. So it's kind of like I am creating a new language. But it just got harder and harder, like every time that except now I'm going to stop. Like I promised myself that I would stop now, because now I feel like I'm at the point where I really want to be with the book, and so now I just, you know, have to produce like 1,000 images to fill an encyclopedia.
Well, no sweat there. But I mean, that really, you know, that I think that's such an important thing process-wise, to be open to. I mean, for myself, I know a lot of times when I'm working on something, a lot of times my projects they don't really start out with me shooting to a concept. It'll be like I'm just taking pictures as part of my life, and then they kind of get organized after the fact. And then a lot of times lately what I'll do is I'll be shooting, I'll notice a theme, and then I'll start working that theme on purpose. But like I've gone through several, there's a project I'm working on right now that I'm hoping to have ready to show people in October. And it's you know, you get to this point where you're like, you're working on it, you like it, you know you're onto something, but it doesn't feel quite right. And you do at some point, like if you're not willing to chuck the whole thing and start over again to make it right, then like on some level maybe you're not really completely committed to making the work good. But it's hard to get really attached to. You get really attached to the thing you've already done and all the hours that you've already put into it. But yeah, I mean that's it's exciting too once you do find that new direction.
Yes. Oh my God. And it's happened to me so many times just with this project. Just with this one, you know, and I've been working on this particular project for like 1.5 years. But it keeps happening until, you know, and even now, I just feel like I'm not always looking for something, but I kind of have a mystical approach to art too, where I feel that there are signals. I feel that there are these muses. Like I still have that kind of feeling from a traditional classic point of view of the arts or the artist, you know, with like the real like think and conceptualize too. But
right.
But even the installation part that also just happened like this week. It was because I was putting together a submission for something, and then I was like, wait, but you know, it just doesn't, I wouldn't be convinced by this, you know, is what I started thinking. And I just think you have to be very critical of yourself, and also you have to be willing to not rush into because when you're an artist or when you're anything, but I mean, there is this like, you want people to see it, you want people to like, you know, you make visual things. What do you want? To stuff them under your couch? I don't think so. You want to be seen.
Right.
You know? And so, and there is an appreciation level, and, you know, at least I'm one of the artists that is willing to accept that and not, oh no, I just make art for myself. I mean, I do make it for myself, but I do want to share it.
Yeah, that's something, believe me, I could go on and on about that.
And so sometimes you're so caught up in that, like, I want to show it now. I want to, I want the recognition now. And there's this ego thing that sometimes gets in the way. But if you're willing to put that ego, to pat it on the back and say, like, no, because it's not ready yet. Mm-hmm. It's not, it just takes a long time. And, also we live in a world where you get an email, you have to respond it now. You get a text message, you have to respond now. You want everything now. And patience becomes such a complex concept to even grasp. And to make something that is really interesting and true, you have to be willing to go through the maturity of it. Let it mature, let it sit. And be willing to say, why not? Like, this could be this. Like, I already had like these 3D objects. I already had like the images. I already had these rocks that I've been gathering and collecting. And I was like, wait, this is an installation, and I already have a fictional story. Now it's just going to be a fictional museum show created by these fictional institutions. And so I think that just fiction is something that I never realized was just my work. I always related it more towards the dream world, but it's just the imagination world. Mm-hmm. It's just the world of fiction and the world of, and I think that's where photography really does it for me as a medium, at least where I started, because you're using reality in some way, like real. You take pictures of real things that exist. Right. And but then it becomes kind of unreal. Like, I'm interested in that fiction, that mix, that balance between what really exists, what you can see, what is tangible, and what is intangible.
Yeah. All right, that was my conversation with Carolina Montejo. If you want to check out more of her work, you can find it on her site at carolinamontejo.com. There's a link in the show notes. If you have any comments or questions about, really about anything, you can reach me via email at podcast@keepthechannelopen.com. You can also find me in the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. If you like what we're doing here, you can subscribe through iTunes or Stitcher or your favorite podcast app. You can also leave a rating or review on iTunes, and that does help new listeners find the show. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next week's guest will be San Diego-based artist Pastilla, so tune in for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.